Hi everyone, thank you for being here. So the image on the screen is the image of my front door when I moved into my loft in 1984. And the reason I'm showing the image of my front door is that a lot of my work has revolved around what goes on around my front door, which is a pretty interesting location because I live just south of Canal Street. One would call it Tribeca. I don't really think it's a neighborhood where I live, but so that's my front door in 1983, and this is my front door today. So you can see that there's been a major shift in the economics of the neighborhood and of the city in between those two front doors. And the first front door, at that time, in 1983, there were 100,000 homeless people living on the streets of New York. And I had just moved here, and having just moved here, I started, thanks. I started taking pictures of all these temporary shelters that I was finding in the neighborhood, most of them around City Hall, which Giuliani hadn't changed yet, so there was no fence there. That was before Giuliani. But I started photographing the shelters just because, having just moved to New York, I had gotten my MFA in San Francisco at the Art Institute. Oh, and backtracking, before my MFA, I got a near PhD in French theater. I wrote the first chapter of my dissertation on the theater aesthetic of Jean Genet. And then I was imagining the rest of my life in a library, and I thought, no, I don't think I want to be doing that. So I dispensed with the rest of my thesis. I'm ABD, and I never felt guilty about it for a second. That was my achievement. In the meantime, most people I know were keeping their PhDs in their freezers because that was the only place, if the house burned down, that it would be safe. So when I moved to New York, which was a radical change from San Francisco, where there's nature, and in New York, you really have to hunt to find any nature, I started walking the streets looking at what I thought was unbelievable, because I'm sure many of you who have had this experience coming from other places, you have an image in your mind of New York as Park Avenue, Madison Avenue, skyscrapers, and that's not the total reality of New York. So I started photographing these shelters, not really knowing what I was going to do with them. And I particularly like the irony of this one, which is not too far from my loft. And also I noticed people really made their shelters, as you can see, with blankets and cardboard for sheets, and ways to make them resemble actual beds or something like homes. And eventually, I had my first solo show in New York at the Sculpture Center, which back then was uptown on the Upper East Side, and Marion Griffiths was an amazing curator of that space, who gave solo shows to a lot of women, Peter Coyne being one of them, Beverly Semmes. And I showed this piece. So when I showed this piece, I already had many, many slides of shelters. 81 of them fill a slide carousel. And I built this out of concrete blocks. There's a piece of wood in there, and the racks are sitting on that piece of wood, and there's a slide projector under that, projecting the slides onto what I was calling the pillow. But as I was thinking about it, I realized that what I was talking about here was a really serious economic situation. And through photographing the shelters, I had talked to many homeless people, and I actually developed a relationship with this guy, Scott, whose shelter I have in the photograph. So I decided that I would buy a shelter from somebody who was sleeping on the street, and I began negotiating the purchase of this shelter from Scott. And that was totally naive on my part. If you're living on the street, you don't want any money, it's going to get taken from you in a second, you know. But anyway, I negotiated the purchase of the shelter. I put up my show, and then I felt really weird. And part of it was this really raw juxtaposition of the images that I had taken and this actual shelter sitting there. And the other part of it was that I had seen and talked to Scott a lot, and then suddenly the show was up, and what was I going to do? So I kept going there daily to talk to Scott, because basically I was the only person that he ever had a conversation with. And I kept this up for probably a year and a half. In the meantime, the reception for this piece, which, you know, is sort of art and life, but you could also call it aestheticizing a situation that shouldn't be aestheticized, was a pretty, the conversation became really articulated. And in other words, I had posed a problem. So I was really interested in the fact that I had posed a problem. That to me was like a measure of something positive that could happen from a situation like this, is that you're asking questions about maybe what can art be, or how can I address something like this? If I really want to talk about it, how do I do that? I can't say that anything was resolved, but I just, you know, created a situation where the conversation kept coming about, and whenever I talked about the work or showed the work, the conversation had nothing to do with the work and everything to do with homelessness. And right about that time, I also was asked to do a piece in Petrosino Park. I think it still has that name. But it's the park between Soho and Little Italy, and where you see that deli sign in the back, there's a really great taco place, if you like tacos today. But so that was a really interesting experience for me, because it was out of the studio. In other words, I didn't have free rein. I was invited to do a piece. I had to submit proposals. They rejected the first 3. I proposed a fountain. They said, no, water is too dangerous. Then I proposed to mount a porta-san toilet on a pedestal and keep it clean for the entire time, the entire duration of the show. They said, no, someone could shoot up and die inside. I mean, there were reasons that the city could not support any of those ideas. And I grew up in Quebec City, but my parents had moved to Montreal, and I had gone back to Montreal, where there is a center, the Canadian Centre for Architecture, which is a really amazing museum. And I went there and I saw this show of constructivist proposals. And it gave me the idea to transform the work into what you see here. So it's steel with mirror. And the text from the first paragraph of Tale of Two Cities is written backwards on the sidewalk. So you can read it forwards if you were walking back and forth in front of the mirror. And I decided to hop the fence because I didn't want it all contained in one space. So the interesting thing about doing that piece was that the environment was a mess when I went to see it, and I called up the city and I said, I'm going to be installing an artwork. Are you going to clean the park? And they said yes, and I got there, and the whole crew had to spend a day and a half cleaning the park. It was really disgusting. And the day after I installed the piece, this is what it looked like. So I went there and I picked up, and I went back 3 or 4 days doing the same thing, picking up the trash. And then I thought, no, this isn't my job. So I started calling the city every single day. And finally, I trained the city to go there and clean the park like they might clean Madison Avenue or Lexington or Park Avenue. So when I took the piece down a number of months later, they people in the neighborhood came to me and said, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, it's the end of the show." "No, you can't take it down." And the reason being I had kept the park clean, and I said, you know, now it's your job. Keep the park clean. So I was really interested in this question of how people are represented in the media. The word homeless didn't really exist before the 80s, I don't think. And one of the quotes that Scott had, because I also did a long interview with him, and I didn't show it, but I pinned the interview to the back wall, and I got shit for that too. You know, text, no. But, you know, text is part of my vocabulary, and I insisted on using text. But he said, you know, they packaged me amongst a lot of people that they classified as homeless. So homeless became a designation, and most people thought of homeless people as derelicts, but in fact, many homeless people had been turned out of mental institutions because the Reagan administration stopped supporting them. Other homeless people simply couldn't afford to pay the rent, and this was a viable option. By the Manhattan Bridge, there was an enormous community. It was mostly a Chinese community that had built shelters there, and a Chinese friend of mine had talked to one of them who explained to her that, you know, in my village, this is how we lived. One guy even put plumbing in right there next to the Manhattan Bridge. So I was really thinking about how the media, both words and images, function in our lives and control what we're thinking about. And I became obsessed with, it didn't look like this back then, with the fact that we could basically support the whole country of Guatemala on the amount of display that we have in Times Square. And I was thinking about what is on all of those displays, and basically it's all ads, right? It's ads, it's stock quotes, and maybe a bit of news, and never anything too controversial in the news. So I decided that I was going to create local channels and use every opportunity that I had to show work, to do it in a public space and do it with video. And at this point I had actually started working with video. I made a video about women in the legal profession. I'm not going to show you that. It's an okay video, but basically I did interviews with my great aunt who got a law degree in 1921 when women couldn't even take the bar exam, and then with 3 women judges, and I cut all those interviews with footage of how women were being treated in court cases on trial. So that was footage from Hollywood movies. But I was thinking about the question of representation, and I was invited to do a piece at Snug Harbor on Staten Island as the Newhouse Center for Contemporary Art. And when I went over there, I saw the ferry terminal building, and I thought, aha, here's a space. And I decided that what I was going to do was present the work in that space. So they asked me to collaborate with a community group. It was the first time that I had done that, but I thought that that was an interesting idea. It took me a year and a half to it took me, I would say, 4 months before anybody trusted me enough to even talk to me seriously. And then I met a woman in the community center who was more or less the mayor of the place, and she and I developed a relationship that enabled this entire process. So this is what the place looked like before I installed the work, and what I did was turn that entire room basically into a large-scale TV set with, you know, some speakers. And I worked with community to, and these are members, Joan up here in the center top is the person that I became very close to, and I'm still in touch with her, and I've done another work with her and her family. But without her, I never would have been able to do this piece. But what I did was I taught people in the community center how to use video equipment. And then she and I together edited the video that we shot. So video, to begin with, I nearly got killed for going outside with a video camera because there were a lot of illegal activities going on right on that block, and nobody wanted to be filmed. So we learned right away that the cameras had to be within the compound. We couldn't go out onto the street with the cameras. And then there was the whole problem of the same people never showing up twice, which I also wasn't prepared for. So a year and a half later, I put up this piece, and it was a really interesting work experience for me. For one of the reasons that you see all of these squares of images, and here's another shot, which I animated the images moving across the screen, was that I didn't shoot any of this because I felt like it wasn't my role to do the representing, and if it were my eye behind the lens of the camera, I would be seeing differently from how people in the community were seeing. So I gave them the camera, and of course, even though I had taught them how to use the camera, even though there was a tripod, there was a lot of footage that wasn't really usable. And so I took everything that I could that was usable and created this animation, and we had a 9-minute video here in the Staten Island Ferry Terminal building. So round about the same time I was doing that, I was invited to do a piece in England, in Middlesbrough. Again, a community project. They knew that I was working on one community project, and they invited me to come over and do another one. And this was a totally different experience that made me jealous of people over there because there was so much support. In the project that I did, basically I was on my own. I even had to use my own mini DV camera, which at that point cost me, I think, something like $1,200, which isn't a fortune, but back then that was an expensive camera. It was a small little thing. And they had a huge Hi8 camera in the community center, but that was way too intimidating for people to use. And Hi8 was a format that never lasted too long anyway because the tape stretches and a lot of other technical stuff. Anyway, here I had infinite amounts of support, and I was only there for 10 days. They treated me like a princess. They took me everywhere. I met various community groups. We set up a structure. We set up a website for this structure, and I actually never got to see the piece because I was supposed to fly on 9/10. In other words, the day before, no, I was supposed to fly on 9/11 and couldn't get out. So they did an interview with me over the phone, and they set up this, this piece in my absence. But what was really a learning experience for me here was that the entire time I had spent working with the community on Staten Island, I was really committed and really interested in the process, but I also felt like I was doing social work. And when I did this piece, it was a very similar kind of process, but I had so much support, it was actually possible to accomplish it. And so it became a really interesting experience in that regard. This is some of the footage. We turned it all green. We played with it. This was part of the community group in the blue screen studio at the television center. The other thing about England is that they've got, there's a large segment in the northeast of England that has been destroyed because there's no longer a coal industry, there's no longer a shipbuilding industry. And what they've done is bring digital media into the communities, trying to encourage e-business and trying to provide alternatives so that people can actually find a way to stay alive. So we shot this, and through a website, we superimposed it on historic footage of that neighborhood. This was the town square where the truck that you saw was installed. And so we superimposed the footage, but I also gave a Photoshop workshop to these kids in the community center so that they understood that news can be manipulated. And the whole idea was trying to put out a local voice, getting people to say what they wanted to say. So they did all the research, they found all the footage, they recorded audio of people in the community, they uploaded it to a website, and from that, in New York, I edited the footage and we had a director's forum. So I'm jumping because my work actually, there are threads in my work, but nothing is ever chronological. You never know what I might do next. So this was after the Iraq War broke out, and the artifacts had been destroyed from the Baghdad Museum. And so I created this billboard that traveled around the streets of New York showing artifacts from the museum. There have always been two sides to my work, and some of it is, you know, kind of goofy, and the other, anyway. So once I'm into the videos, I might as well show you my little box of Nazis. So my little box of Nazis actually started because I was traveling and I met some Nazis. And at that time, I took 2 pictures of the storefront that they had full of Nazi memorabilia. And I started noticing that there were a lot of Nazis in the news. But at the time, I got a 1-semester invitation to go teach in Tallahassee, Florida, Florida State University. And I thought, gee, this looks like the Deep South, I'd better go. So it was, in fact, the Deep South, and there was a KKK meeting 40 miles from where I landed, right after I landed there, which was pretty interesting. And I had some slides in this box. And my students used to joke and they'd say, here she comes with her little box of Nazis. So I called this video My Little Box of Nazis. So when I made that, I thought it was hilarious. I guess it's not so hilarious. But a curator came to my studio and he said, you know, you ought to make that into you ought to make that into a video because it could travel a lot further than a slideshow. And I thought, that's not a bad idea. And I sent it off to a festival in Eastern Europe that was looking for videos that dealt with East and West, and they invited me to go. So I went, and it was a totally fascinating experience because, first of all, nobody talks about that or didn't over there then. And a curator from Germany said to me, why did you make that? And I said, well, I was traveling and I met some Nazis, and he said, nobody here would ever say that. And that was an education because, in fact, everybody I was sitting with who was German, if their parents were alive, had to have somehow shown sympathy or not spoken up in order to be alive today. And so many other works developed from this Nazi strain to the point where I had to invent a character to get myself out of it because Nazi, Nazi, Nazi was in my head. So I invented a persona. Her name was Fluffy Logan, and her mission was to do everything that I would never do. And so I made a lot of videos that are really funny, cooking with my feet. They're all on my website, and they're quite visual, and they're really fun. And the real problem I had with this was that everybody loved Fluffy. You know, Perry is difficult, but Fluffy was okay. So, so that really posed a dilemma, which, you know, maybe I've gotten over it, or maybe part of Fluffy has come into Perry, I don't know. But at the time I was reading this book by Sherry Turkle, Life on the Screen, Identity in the Age of the Internet, and she was saying how natural it is for people to have several different personae and, you know, behave differently in different situations. And I thought, yeah, that makes total sense. You know, if I'm a teacher, I'm one person. If I'm at home having an argument with my husband, I'm somebody you're probably not going to see here, and blah, 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 right? So we all have multiple aspects to our personalities. And nevertheless, she posed a problem for quite a while. Anyway, back to trucks and back to my front door, which now gets these tour buses unloading every day. And the tour buses unload because people are going to Canal Street to buy knockoff goods. And so where my first video dealt with homelessness, now, or my first work about my front door dealt with homelessness, now I was focused on what was going on in front of my front door and how was this actually happening. Because still today, as you know, the tour buses all drop tourists off there to go buy these goods. If the goods are illegal, which they are because they're knockoffs, and there are Louis Vuitton police that come and periodically arrest people. And here's a still from the video that I made from this. So if the goods are knockoffs and you're not supposed to be selling them, how is it that every tour bus that takes people on a tour in New York City ends up there? And how is it that the cops come by, they arrest people, and the same activity goes on again and again and again? So I started thinking about how I could possibly record this event. And it took me a long time to figure out that I was just going to stand there with my camera, totally still, for as long as I could stand, which ended up being 5 hours. And I was going to catch the moment when the cop walks by and when people run in the opposite direction, and then the second he's passed, they go right back and they set up again. And I stood there for 5 hours and I didn't think that I had gotten that footage. And the thing is that Canal Street is really active, as you know. And what I did in my studio was I turned the footage black and white because I just couldn't see. There was too much going on. And when I finally found the footage, I slowed it down. So generally I don't even think in those terms, but it made total sense for me to create an edit that way. So this is the video.
Colors $8, 6.
I went to Canal Street. One of my friends came from the Poconos, and she's like, I want a Louis Vuitton. And I said, I know exactly where we go, Canal Street. So we took the subway, we got there, and it was a really busy day because it was Martin Luther King Day. Everybody was off from work. And we didn't really see them right off. And then we went into this store, and it went way back. So we walked back there, and sure enough, there they were. They had the Prada, Louis Vuitton, every brand name you'd ever imagine. And she picked out a bag that she liked, and then all of a sudden, you hear the Nextel buttons on their phones going, and then, you know, they're talking in Chinese, and they slam the metal door. So we're locked in this store, and my boyfriend's like, oh my God, what did you get us into? And I'm like, I hear this happens a lot. It's okay, don't worry, we'll be okay. So we're standing there, and then there are women coming and grabbing the purses, not the shoppers, but the storekeepers, grabbing the Louis Vuitton bags and taking them into these private, like, you would open like a wall. It was almost like a secret passageway, and they would dump the purses down there. So I guess the Louis Vuitton bags were the ones that they'd really be in trouble for. So we're just standing there, and my boyfriend's like, well, I want to get out. And you hear, New York City police, open up, NYPD. And I'm like, oh my God, this is serious. So we're just standing there, and it's cold out, and it was icy. And what they made us do was go through the back of the store, scale like this tiny area that was covered in ice, and then run behind the store away. But my friend did get a bag, so.
Diamonds, get your diamonds. $7 tía, pata.
Yeah, that woman yelled at me, crazy fucking bitch. I was filming from far away, you know, and I thought about it for a long time, whether or not how I could do, basically it was just so crowded I couldn't figure out how I could do it. Also, I'm not 6 feet tall. It's a disadvantage quite often. but yeah, they saw me filming. But at a certain point, I decided I'm just going to go out there and, you know, see what happens. Well, yeah, that voice, I was walking with a friend, and she asked me what I was working on, and I was telling her about this Canal Street video, and she said, oh, you know, I have a student who has this incredible story, and I said, do you think she'd tell it to me on tape? And she said, yeah. So I got that story from her. Actually, you know what? She might have asked me not to show her face. I think she did. Who are selling it? Because the people change every day of the week, and I don't think that anybody would be implicated. You mean being worried for the safety of those people? Well, you're bringing up the same question about my homeless piece, in a way. You're saying I'm aestheticizing a situation. I kind of felt like I was recording a street experience. The fact of people getting arrested, they get arrested every day. And I've talked to a number of people who have gotten arrested. In fact, I'm in conversation now with, you know, the territory has changed a lot. Now there are West Africans who sell on the corner of Lisbonard and Canal, and they all speak French, and I speak French. And they're really interesting because they're a community, and they share food. There are women who come and deliver food to them. So I've gotten into conversations with them, and I've asked them about getting arrested and all that. And the thing is that the cops aren't allowed to ask them whether they have green cards or whether they're here legally or not. Basically what happens when they get arrested is they spend a night in jail and they lose the take for the day. You know, so I felt like in filming them, I wasn't really implicating anyone any differently from how they're implicated now, but I also feel that there has to be some kind of complicity in this system, because the tour buses are going, the cops are going, the people are still selling. If it were really a crime, this whole thing would disappear, but it's a moneymaker. You know, there are 6 hotels that have opened right around where I live in the last year. Right there on Canal Street, there's a new Sheraton, a block further up there's another one, and at the corner of Lafayette there's a 3rd one, and then there's a highbrow one, the James Hotel on the corner of 6th Avenue, and then there's the Hilton Garden Inn at the corner of 6th on the south side of Canal. So, you know, it's a marketplace. Yeah. So, but you're right, you know, I mean, I think that's a really good question. Well, the truth is I made a version of this that wasn't quite as tough, and it wasn't as good. You know, there were elements in it that made it seem more like the Wild West. I mean, the street, you know, it's chaos there, right? So it's more than surveillance. It's also sort of a document of something that's going on in every major city in the world. If you go to Berlin, if you go to London, if you go to Tokyo, I mean, all these the whole knockoff trade is everywhere, right? So it's, to me, sort of also a document of the consumer culture, and that was more how I was looking at it. I think your point is well taken. It's very definitely surveillance. I went for the moments when the cops were, you know, grabbing at these guys who, by the way, were only black guys that they approached and, you know, dug into their bags. So, so yeah, it made it edgier. Shoot me. No, I think, you know, we do have to fight surveillance, especially on all the levels that we're currently being surveilled, right? But it takes support of people like Edward Snowden, Julian Assange, you know, people who are really doing something critical about it. So I'm showing you this because I actually did it in 1999, but it led between that and the terminal salon piece that I did in the Staten Island Ferry Terminal building. It led to my global remake of Man with a Movie Camera. So in '99, I was invited to go to Bulgaria and create a work for a show called Video Archaeology. And I don't speak Bulgarian, and I don't read Cyrillic, although I tried hard to learn the alphabet before I went. And I collaborated with an artist named Boyan Dobrev who wanted to learn how to use video. And so together we reshot 4 minutes of Vertov's Man with the Movie Camera. And when I came back to New York, we shot it with my little mini DV, the same one that I had used for Staten Island. Nobody in Sofia was walking around with a little mini DV back then. He was teaching in the Academy of Fine Arts there, where they had all of 3 computers in 1999. And so I shot this footage in Bulgaria with him. And when I got back to New York, I thought, well, there's a lot missing from this because my camera's tiny, Vertov's camera is huge. So I built a cardboard camera and I superimposed footage of myself carrying that cardboard camera instead of a little mini DV on footage that I had shot in Bulgaria. But at the same time, I was thinking that there has to be a better way to do a remake. And I came up with this idea to have other people do it for me. So, and one of the reasons I came up with this idea altogether had to do with the trip I took in 1997 to Dessau, where I met a bunch of techie people, and a year later went to the Symposium on Electronic Arts in Manchester in the UK, and Liverpool. And I got the idea then that video doesn't have to be a closed system, that, you know, once you make a video, it's finished, you've got a DVD or you've got a file or you've got something, but basically you've worked on this thing like my video Traffic and it's done, and if you want to make more, you have to go into it and do it again. And when I was installing the piece in the ferry terminal building, somebody came up to me and he said, well, how do I get in that picture? And it was already edited. So I was thinking a lot about this idea of how you can make something that is an open system rather than a closed system. But also because I had been in Germany at that time and I met some Serbs that I became very close to. I met people from a bunch of different countries, in other words. And I had this idea of having these people involved in a collaboration with me. So I got this opportunity or a commission to do this project, which is a global remake of Man with the Movie Camera. And I have to confess, for the first year that I was involved in this, I had no idea what I was doing. I got an email saying, congratulations, you got a commission. And I needed a programmer. It needed to open within 6 months. And I found a programmer, John Weir, who was absolutely brilliant and did an amazing job. But he told me he was too busy. And while I was being told not to tell anybody because they wanted to release the information, I very nervously started writing down every single shot in the film with the length of each shot. And I called up John and I said, well, can we just meet? And I went over there with 13 pages of numbers. And if you ever want a programmer, just go with numbers. So he said, okay, I'll do it. So, so I launched this program, this piece with him, which for the first year we were involved in it, didn't function all that well. But what I understood was that in order to do something participatory, I needed some participation right away. And so all these people that I had been talking to, I found 12 people in different parts of the world, and I contacted them and I said, would you send out this email to people within your network and be responsible for the upload of 1 minute's worth of video, either shots or a scene or blah, blah. And so I found people in South America and China and Japan and Pakistan and London and Serbia and Lebanon, some of them former students here, like Zina El Khalil, who is a junior TED fellow now, and she goes by the name of Om, but Megumi Akiyoshi, who also went to school here from Japan. Both of them found me collaborators in their countries. And so through that, I was able to launch the beginnings of this. And then, of course, I sent emails and et cetera to everyone I knew. So the way this works is that anybody can upload footage to the film. And if you look at, you can scroll through this either through the scenes or by the tag. And if you look at shot number 2, for example, shot number 19, scene number 2, there are 22 uploads. And then the following shot, and if you click on any one of them, I see that they use this one on the poster, it will play in sync with the original. So basically what happens, this guy, Nelson Ricardo from Rio de Janeiro, I had a collaborator in Rio, Simone Michelin. He did this whole scene, and it only played for 1 day, because what happens is that has 22 uploads, but this one only has 19. So as soon as somebody else uploaded his second shot, the software would select different shots each day, and his 4 shots would never play together again except for the first day. But I happened to catch them on the first day, and then I was able to, this is a very short shot, download it, which I did. So anybody who uploads, you can also upload by tags, so there are a bunch of tags here. I did a really lousy job on the tags. They could have been a lot better than this, but I had no idea what I was doing when I did this. So if you pick bar, for example, and if you have a shot of someone in a bar, you can upload. And in order to upload, you just click on the word upload, and you choose the file. It's sort of like anything else you might be doing on the web. And then you fill in the info below. And then if you have a website and you list it there, it links to your website. So everything in yellow here is people's websites who have contributed to the piece. And every day a new film plays with can I lower the audio? Whoops, So every day a new film plays on the website, and I really love the titles of this film, which I feel is Vertov's manifesto. This film presents an experiment in the cinematic communication of visible events without the aid of intertitles. This is 1929. The original is on the left, without the aid of a scenario, without the aid of theater, a film without sets, actors, etc. This experimental work aims at creating a truly international, absolute language of cinema based on its total separation from the language of theater and literature. So that's brilliant. And he contradicts himself right away in the film, just about with the first shot, which you'll see here in a second. this shot. So you see there's a mound. Oh. Okay, in this shot, you have this view of the camera, but then you have a superimposition and you have this mound and the cameraman on top of that. And this film is totally performative. It's just a brilliant film, and the editing in the film, there's not a single shot longer than 22 seconds. So between the performative aspect, the documentary aspect, the experimental edits in the film, I thought that there were enough different kinds of languages to invite a lot of different types of participation. So on this website, you can actually view the entire remake on a daily basis. And when I launched the project, I had a set of rules for myself, which was that I would never upload, which I have never done. And because I would have uploaded everything, you know. Oh, look, I saw a guy on his exercise machine on a rooftop one day, and I thought, that's a great shot in there. I know just where to put it, you know. But so I never have uploaded. But then my other rule was that I would accept absolutely everything I got. And I will confess that I have nixed some things. Some of the things I nixed, well, and here's the other part of the story, is that I gave a lecture somewhere about 1.5 years ago, and I turned on the, oh, this is great. On the right, this is Powell Bajtaj. He's standing on a pile of crushed cars. But I was showing the film, and it was the worst version of the film I ever saw. It was, you know, like some days all these great shots come up, and then some days it's like a mix of good and bad, and then some days it's just absolutely the worst. And I thought, oh no, how can I be showing this? And so then I invited, there are 57, I think, scenes in this. The scenes are arbitrary. They were just organized in order to let people upload to the film. But I invited 57 people to curate a selection for each scene. And the interesting thing was I invited people who had uploaded, who had participated, or people, curators I knew who were interested. And the interesting thing about it was that it started looking, you know, the web is really messy, and it started looking very clean. So somewhere between messy and clean, you know, there's an answer to this. But anyway, this has been a very engaging project that's taken me way too long. I think it took 2 years before it was truly running smoothly, because first of all, when we started it, we thought that we could upload a minute's worth of film, but the web couldn't handle a minute's worth of film. And so we had to get people who had been trying to upload a minute to break down their minute's worth of film shot by shot, which was already a lot of work. And there were a lot of blips along the way, so almost anywhere I went to present this, I'd have to call John and say, John, the site's down. But, you know, like 2 years later, it sort of got straightened out. Anyway, he did an amazing job of doing this. Here. This was uploaded by a guy from Mexico, and I forget where this came from. Early on, I knew where all the shots were coming from, and then I've sort of lost track at some point. I'm going to escape this. You guys can go on the website. You can upload. And this is a piece I did in Montreal based on an old theater. So I've gotten sort of deeper into the history of cinema. In Montreal in 1906, a man named Louis Ouimet opened a movie theater. And I did an installation called Democroscope based on the idea of his movie theater. So it cost $10 to go, 10 cents to go to the movies back then. But what I did for this project was I also do quite a bit of curating, and I'm really interested in how programs for early cinema, and actually I think I've got one here. Yeah, programs for early cinema really resemble what you encounter on the web. Like here, the program for May 28th, and this was 1906, Washerwoman and Chimney Sweep, Miniature Theater, Niagara Falls in Winter, Golden Gate Panorama, Burglar's Surprise, Human Butterfly, Silver Wedding. It's totally great, right? And if you go on YouTube, this is kind of what you get, but also these early films were about that kind of length. And so I had the idea to curate, to put together programs of early films, early ads, with artists' videos, and I made an open call for short videos. This is what the theater used to look like. This is what that space looks like now, but since then it's been turned into condos. This was the ad, and we made ours 16:9 ratio, but we used his language in that. Venez en foule means come as a crowd. And then I projected this Record of a Sneeze, which was the very first film ever. It's like a second long, and it's this man sneezing onto the floor. And then all of these small monitors in the back contained edited programs that put together artist videos with pieces of early films. So this idea of working with early cinema or early video is something that still interests me. This piece is Mothlight Distributed, and it was based on Stan Brackage's early film Mothlight. I met him back when, and it was right when Mothlight, which was, he glued moth wings between two strips of film, and he sent it to a processing lab. And it created this really beautiful animation of moth wings. And when I looked on YouTube, there are all these versions of Mothlight, and some of them are all pink, and they're only 1 minute long, and that one has 206,000 views. And the one on the top left, he filmed it at a screening at the Pompidou, so it's keystoned at the beginning, and it's got a blue tinge to it. In other words, nothing really looks like the original Mothlight. But when I asked Brackage how he felt about Dog Star Man coming out on VHS, he said, well, I hate how it looks, but I love that more people are getting to see it. So that was sort of my excuse for doing this. And this is an image of the piece that I just did in the Biennale in Cartagena in Colombia. And actually, Jung Hee came to my studio and performed in this video, but the piece is called Hotel, and it intentionally shows the absence of the workers. So the flat screen shows the pool guy cleaning the pool, and there's a reflection of the water there. And the tabletop shows two people meticulously setting the table in a sort of very formal hotel style. I'm not going to show the video because the video, I mean, I could, but I think maybe Q&A or something, or comments, or bitching and moaning. Well, actually, I don't think I brought any of the fluffy videos. Well, you could say that cooking marmalade was a fluffy thing, and serving marmalade. All those videos are, they're called the kitchen tapes, and they're on Vimeo. I can send you a link to them if you want. I have made a lot of videos that are in this vein, that, you know, like this is Logic. It's 2 minutes, I can play Logic. I collaborated with a philosopher This is also around the time of the Iraq War, or the launching of the Iraq War. I found a book of Aristotle's syllogisms when I was in the country, and I desperately tried to write a syllogism based on the alert codes, and I was failing miserably. And my friend Nick Pappas is a philosopher, and I called him up and I said, help. And he came over, and within a few seconds, he wrote this script, and then when he read it to me, he did such a great job, I said, will you come back and perform it on camera?
A syllogism is logical discourse in which something other than what is stated must follow from what is stated. For example, if no panic is an emergency, then neither can any emergency be a panic. For if some panic, say elevated risk for example, were an emergency, then because elevated risk is an emergency, it would not be true that no emergency is panic. But we assumed that every elevated risk calls for panic. Every premise states that something either is, or must be, or may be the attribute of something else. If some emergency, orange, were a call for heightened security, yellow, then some of the yellows must be orange, and every severe risk, red, would be yellow. But no orange is yellow. For if none were, then no orange would be an emergency, but red-orange is not yellow-orange. Similarly, if no red were not yellow, then there is no necessity that some of the yellows should not be red-orange. If high severity is not elevated severity, then severe severity, red-red, would be not yellow-red, but severely red, and red-red would not be red-red. And conversely, with the universal terms contraposition. If maximum security thus were not maximum security, then top maximum security would not indicate top maximum elevated severe emergency, nor are both contrariwise, and yet all emergency panics are elevated severe high red, security explosions are security explosion emergencies, high elevated emergencies are not, and neither.
I feel like there can be a lot of latitude in, if you look at Vertov's film, Man with a Movie Camera, which, you know, he's my hero, I think it's brilliant. It's shelved as documentary, but it's also shelved as experimental. So every time you hold up a camera, it's subjective. You know, like, I'm going to see something and you're going to see something different. It's always a subjective view. So I feel like I'm entitled to express my subjective view, even if the footage looks like documentary. You know, and I don't, you know, when I did that homeless piece, Patty Phillips wrote a review of it for Art Forum, and she called me a political artist. And I said, oh no, I've got a label. You know, I mean, labels are important in one way in that you can be marketed and, you know, yeah, it works in that regard. And on the other hand, it can be really stultifying because then you have to continuously turn out one kind of thing. And you know, you could say I'm schizophrenic. There's Fluffy and there's Perry. You know, it's like I can take the liberty to express it how I want. But I think there's a very interesting moment in documentary, this whole idea of reenactment. Last night I saw a film called Uprising at Moma by Peter Snowden. It's really good if you're interested in this kind of thing. But he took a lot of footage off YouTube and made a feature film that he calls a fiction film that is based on 8 days in Egypt. Almost all the footage, I think, came from Egypt. And he took the footage that he found on YouTube and he describes 8 days. It's not the 8 days maybe as they actually happened, but he created a narrative arc in there. So he's using footage that we're all familiar with. The editing is seamless and really impressive. And to me, it doesn't really matter what he wants to call it. You know, it's in documentary fortnight, but he's calling it a fiction film. So I think that there's an acknowledgement. I mean, if you think that, you know, Robert Flaherty's original quote-unquote documentary was restaged. You know, it was something he saw that he staged again. So I think that you have a lot of latitude to define things that the way you want, and then you just have to defend yourself when the shit hits the fan, you know, or if.